Thank you.
Before I start, I would like to thank Social Justice Ireland for this opportunity to come here to give this presentation. It's great to be here in beautiful Ireland. Before I left Finland, a good friend of mine said to me that when you're traveling to Dublin, remember to visit Grove Park. So greetings to Dublin, here I am. Since my time is limited, I better begin. I have divided my presentation into three parts. Firstly, I will discuss shortly the background of the experiment study we have been carrying out this year. Secondly, I will talk about the essential findings and recommendations we have made for our government, how to test basic income in Finland. And then finally, a few words on the experiment bill, which was published on 26th August, and also a few words on possible extension of the experiment in 2018. So the political starting point for the Finnish basic income experiment was a reference that was made to a basic income experiment in the governmental program of our central right-wing coalition government, and that was in May 2015. The second phase was an evaluation, and an evaluation after this evaluation, a consortium led by my employer, Finnish Social Insurance Institution, was appointed to study the suitability of different basic income models for the experiment. And we did offer recommendations for the research setting and the model in our preliminary study, which was published on 30th March 2016, and our work will end on 16th December 2016. And in this final report, originally we were expected to define the final setting for the experiment, which is expected to be launched in 2017. But the new reality is that we will discuss probable extension for coming years, so in 2018, 2019. Yeah, and as I mentioned, according to current plans, we are expecting to see the experiment launch in 2017. One big decision has already been done, which was a constitutional committee which said that there is no constitutional problems to launch the experiment in 2017. So it's not discriminating any people's rights in Finland. Our work based and still bases on an assignment which was handed down by the Prime Minister's office. This assignment outlined 4 different options to explore and develop. The first option was so-called full basic income, which could replace almost all the other benefits in the Finnish system, perhaps excluding earnings-related benefits, which are at a relatively high level in Finland, and would be difficult to replace these by a universal scheme. The second option was partial basic income, which is usually the basic income scheme in the Finnish discussion, so a model which could replace the most of the basic security benefits provided by my employer Kela. And this model, of course, it would leave earnings-related benefits intact, but also housing allowance and social assistance, which is the last resort benefit in Finland. The third choice was negative income tax. I think this would have been politically the most feasible option to test. I don't know how familiar you are with the idea, but it means shortly minimum income which is determined politically and paid unconditionally via taxation system. We also had a short review of universal credit and participation income, but due to the conditionality of these schemes, we didn't see these the right options to test if we are talking about basic income experiment. So why this government and why now? Well, in this assignment there is just one clear target to emphasize, and this is diminishing disincentives in social security. So in other words, to see if basic income increases employment. I have argued that this should be seen as a continuation of the activation policies carried out and pursued in Finland, but also in other Western welfare countries during the last 2 decades. So our governments target is to increase employment by emphasizing labor supply. And why this should not be seen as a paradigm shift, there was a lot of discussion on paradigm shifts earlier today. I think it shouldn't be seen that way, since the same government in tandem is implementing stricter sanctions and more obligations for unemployed persons. I'm not criticizing our government, but this is something which should be bear on mind before writing any articles on this experiment. Well, what we found in our preliminary report, well, it was pretty clear from the beginning that even to test full basic income might be too expensive, since the flat rate taxes needed to implement budget neutral full basic incomes are at relatively high level. As I mentioned, negative income tax might have been politically the most feasible option, but since we don't have real-time information of people's incomes, it means that we cannot test the negative income tax in a reliable way. This is also something what we can learn from the experiments which were carried out in Canada and in the US in the 60s and 70s. There was some bias in results due to the fact that people were under-reporting their incomes. In the Finnish basic income discussion, basic income has been always seen as a practical measure to make work always pay. I know that this is also important part of the international basic income discussion, but the case is not that simple. According to our micro simulations, if we are talking about discussing the basic income model in Finland, so budget neutral partial basic income, it doesn't automatically remove the economic disincentives, since it is really hard to replace housing allowance, social assistance, and the earnings related benefits. In short, I would like to know that strengthening economic work incentives either costs. This could mean, for example, lowering income taxation for certain groups, or means diluting the current level of social security. However, and why I consider basic income an interesting initiative to test is bureaucracy traps and the fact that basic income would for sure mean less delays reporting applications and falling through the social security net. So in other words, it would make working as a part-time basis easier, and also it would make easier to go into self-employment, which are often seen more important part of the future working life. So what we recommended for our government, okay, even though we know that partial basic income does not remove economic incentives, we considered that the most feasible option to test, and we considered that something which would produce interesting results on how basic income works. We recommended the minimum level should correspond to the monthly level of many basic security benefits which are provided by Kela, that is approximately 560 euros a month. But of course, in an ideal situation, there would be different levels of basic income and also different tax rates. Our model, what we recommended, was of course a kind of draft model, that it would not replace earnings-related benefits or housing allowance or social assistance, which is in many countries the last resort benefit. So how to test this model? We consider two-pronged and compulsory randomization way to produce reliable and scientifically reliable results. Compulsory randomization is important so that there's no selection bias in the test groups. The first priority, in our opinion, was and still is nationwide sampling, which would be representative sample and produce generalizable results among the test group. This could be combined with more intensive regional sample for examining externalities. Well, in our final report, we discussed this question in a more scientifically more reliable manner, and we conclude that the budget should be much bigger in order to have reliable regional experiment. And yet, well, the budget, that's the thing. Due to the limited budget, 20 million for 2 years experiment, we recommend to focus on low-income earners, since if you're interested in employment effects, we know that the labor supply response is higher among these groups. We would have wanted to include both unemployed and employed, and according to our so-called power calculations, a sample of 10,000 people would have been big enough to have scientifically reliable results. These calculations, of course, have many estimates which are open for various interpretations, but according to our calculation, 10,000 people were the right number. And we thought that, okay, of course it would be important and interesting to study different groups of people, but since in the assignment the employment effect was emphasized, then this was reasonable setting for that. So what happened then, what our government actually is now suggesting in their bill, they are suggesting the same model, or at least the minimum level, so 560 euros tax-free partial basic income. Taxation, we considered that the new taxation model should have been coordinated with the partial basic income model, but since and due to the primarily time constraints and the willingness of tax administration, there won't be new taxation model implemented in the test. And the problem with this is, of course, that the budget with the current progressive taxation, if this model would be implemented at the state level, the budget deficit would be 11 billion euros a year. Population, we recommended focusing on low-income earners. Well, not as ambitious again. Now the government is suggesting to include just long-term unemployed people, and this is also something due to the budget and time constraints. So it was much easier to write a law, but also including employed people in the sample, it would have meant 8,000 people more. Now 2,000 is enough. Big sample according to our calculations. If we are concentrating on long-term unemployed, so that makes some sense. Duration 2 years, nothing changed in that sense. And yeah, as I have mentioned already many times, exclusive population and taxation can be explained by time and budget, and especially budget constraints. It was expected that there will be major criticism on these things. I could have written all the criticism by myself. It was obvious that certain things just doesn't work in this bill, and it doesn't answer the same. It doesn't answer all the research questions which were given by the government. But still, at the same time, given the government's employment target, this could be described good enough first phase. And I'm not saying this just because you're filming me, but I think this is something which will produce something useful information on these people, so long-term unemployed. As I mentioned, our work as a research consortium will end next month, and there has been a lot of speculation on a possible extension in 2018, and that was not that surprising due to the major criticism on this bill which was published a few months ago. And now we are expected, the government is expecting, and the Ministry of Social and Health Affairs is expecting us to give recommendations how to extend the experiment in 2018. It is pretty obvious that more extensive population is needed to produce enough information on basic income's employment effects. It is also obvious that new taxation model would be necessary to implement for the next phase. But what is especially important is to understand that we need, or we all who are implementing the new experiment, the people need enough time to implement the process, and different parties need to be coordinated better way than it was this year. And in the long term, we will also recommend series of different experiments, so we could test different levels, different taxation models, and different populations. There are a lot of options which should be studied and which would be interesting to study, and I think this discussion will continue in Finland in the coming years. And this is my last slide, some reflections on this year. I think the first priority is when you start to plan the basic income experiment is to define the targets specifically. If you're willing to test employment effects of basic income, you need to do some certain decisions on the research setting. I mentioned a couple of times our power calculations, those bases on the fact that we are testing employment effects. If we were interested in health indicators or well-being indicators, these things would not be that crucial. These things would not be that crucial. Yeah. I've been talking a lot about budget and budget constraints, but at a more general level, I would emphasize political commitment, which is crucial before, during, and even after the experiment. This means enough resources, but it means also patience and awareness of a demanding process. And this awareness of demanding process means also coordination and well-working cooperation between different parties. So what I want to conclude before I finish my presentation is that the basic income experiment is not just an experiment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ville. And we'll take anybody has any quick questions on what I think is a very interesting experiment? Yeah, we've one here. We'll just get you a microphone now. Just 1 second, and if you could identify yourself too, please.
My name's John Baker, and I'm from Basic Income Ireland.
Greetings from Jürgen, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm in reverse. A lot has been said earlier today and in general in the basic income fraternity about the wide appeal of basic income to people from the political right to the political left and so on. Now your experiment has been put in by a right of center government with particular objectives, particular constraints that you've expressed. How does that experience lead you to reflect on the argument that basic income is actually something that has a wide political appeal? Does it make you think that actually there's something bogus about that, and that different versions of basic income have an appeal to different political perspectives?
Yeah, I think discussing basic income at a general level is really problematic, and different political actors will have different targets, and combining these different targets may be too difficult. I think in the context of digital economy, if we see more precarious labor markets, I think this is something which might
the enough solid ground for wide coalitions in order to implement basic income. But currently in Finland, if we think this target is employment target, and then at the same time, if we see the discourse on digital economy and technological unemployment, it's hard to see that these two political groups could have the same kind of model and same kind of targets in the context of basic income. I don't know if I answered your question, but